Soft daylight spilled through the floor to ceiling windows of the upscale restaurant overlooking the city. White tablecloths draped like quiet waves, glassware gleamed, and the polished silver reflected every movement. The room carried the hush of wealth measured, elegant, a world where even whispers felt expensive. Lena, the young waitress on shift, moved through the dining room with a kind of invisible grace. She adjusted her apron for the third time, wishing the knot in her chest tightened a little less each day. At 23, she'd mastered the art of disappearing. Light footsteps, gentle voice, eyes down when needed. But none of that softened the pressure of working in a restaurant where every customer felt like they owned the skyline behind them. As she approached the table by the window, she first noticed the older woman, silver hair swept neatly, pearl earrings, posture dignified despite her frailty. The woman's hand trembled slightly as she tried to speak, her brows knitting the way someone does when searching for a word no one recognizes. Her son, the sharply dressed billionaire beside her, tapped his fingers impatiently on the polished surface. Hello everyone! Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Lena leaned in, offering the woman a soft smile. Can I help you with anything, ma'am? But before the woman could respond, Lena caught the faintest sound on her lips, half-pronounced vowels, familiar rhythm, Italian. The realization hit like a gentle spark. Lena lowered herself to eye level, her voice shifting effortlessly, naturally, into the language she'd tucked away for years. Signora, vuole dell'acqua o qualcos'altro? Ma'am, would you like some water or something else? The transformation on the woman's face was instant. Her eyes brightened, her hand reached out for Lena's with grateful strength. A small, emotional laugh escaped her as she answered back in Italian, her tone suddenly animated, alive. The billionaire's reaction was the opposite. He jerked slightly, eyebrows rising, his entire posture snapping from bored detachment to stunned focus. His hand hovered mid-air as if the room itself had paused around him. You speak Italian? He asked, disbelief softening into something unreadable. Lena nodded politely, just enough to make sure she's comfortable. But the older woman wasn't done. Still holding Lena's hand, she spoke again, her accent melodic, her voice thick with sentiment. Lena answered gently, matching her tone like someone who understood not just the language but the emotion behind it. People at nearby tables slowed their conversations. A few servers glanced over. It wasn't loud, but it felt momentous, the kind of human moment that made an entire room lean in. The billionaire's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with sharp curiosity. Where did you learn to speak like that? Lena hesitated, carefully choosing her words. I lived in Florence for a while, years ago. Florence? He repeated, his voice low, his posture leaning closer. My mother hasn't spoken this much to anyone outside our family in months. The older woman squeezed Lena's hand again, murmuring something that sounded like, You remind me of someone. Lena's breath caught. Not because she understood the words, but because of how deeply the woman seemed to mean them. The billionaire noticed. His gaze sharpened. What exactly did she say to you? Lena gently released the woman's hand and straightened. Nothing to worry about. She's just very kind. Okay. But the air between them tightened. The billionaire's eyes stayed locked on her, not hostile, but searching, measuring. People don't just speak perfect Italian out of nowhere, he said quietly. There's a story there. Lena's throat tightened. If only he knew how right he was. She forced a steady breath and offered a professional smile. Is there anything else I can bring you? Before he could answer, his mother touched his arm, whispering in Italian again, soft, affectionate, almost pleading. He listened, his expression shifting through layers Lena couldn't decipher. When he finally looked back at her, there was something softer in his eyes, something that made her pulse stumble. This isn't over, he murmured. I want to know more. Lena stepped away, heart pounding, unaware that the moment she turned her back, the The billionaire watched her with a gaze that held questions, dangerous ones, meaningful ones, and the first spark of a decision that would change her life. A decision that, soon, would arrive in the form of a plane ticket. The restaurant settled back into its elegant rhythm, yet Lena could feel an invisible thread pulling her attention toward the window table where the billionaire and his mother sat, because every small gesture from them now felt heavier than the porcelain plates she carried across the room. Although she tried to steady her breathing and force her body into its familiar routine of graceful movements, her thoughts kept circling the moment when the older woman's face had lit up at the sound of her Italian, as if a locked door had quietly swung open without anyone noticing. The sous chef barked orders from the kitchen, sending bursts of urgency through the swinging doors, and the orchestra of clinking glassware and hushed conversations resumed its polished hum. Yet beneath the surface, Lena sensed a new tension building like a quiet storm waiting to break. The billionaire's eyes followed her every time she crossed his line of sight, not with the entitled impatience she was accustomed to from wealthy customers, but with a kind of sharp curiosity that made her skin prickle under the soft lights reflecting off the windows. She carried a tray of sparkling water to another table, reminding herself to maintain her posture, her calm, and her professionalism, though her mind replayed the billionaire's question about Florence with an unsettling clarity. When she passed the host stand, she caught her manager speaking in a hushed voice to a server, clearly unaware that Lena could hear every word drifting through the ambient music. He muttered something about VIP sensitivity and unexpected interactions, making Lena's stomach tighten because she had seen that expression before, the one managers used right before delivering reprimands wrapped in polite concern. She tried to push the sound of their whispering aside, hoping it was merely a misunderstanding, but their sideways glances suggested a deeper suspicion brewing beneath the surface, the kind that could jeopardize the job she desperately needed to keep. As she made her way to the kitchen to collect a risotto order, Julian, one of the senior servers, stepped into her path with an expression hovering between annoyance and false sympathy, reminding her how some coworkers resented any attention she received, especially from high-profile customers. He lowered his voice and said that the billionaire had been asking questions about her, insisting that she should be careful because wealthy men seldom looked at staff without a motive, leaving her with a lingering unease that mixed irritation with fear. She brushed past him with a polite nod, unwilling to let his skepticism feed the anxiety steadily climbing her spine, because she knew that caring too much about others' assumptions only made survival harder in upscale spaces like this. In the kitchen, the clatter of pans and the hiss of steam surrounded her in a chaotic warmth that contrasted the cold pressure she felt from the dining floor, and for a brief moment she let the noise drown out her thoughts. She accepted the plated risotto, steadied the dish, and stepped back toward the dining room with the careful elegance drilled into her during training, reminding herself that stability came from repetition and grace under scrutiny. Still, she couldn't escape the sense that the billionaire's gaze followed her like a spotlight, illuminating pieces of her past she had worked tirelessly to bury under years of anonymity and hard work. When she returned to their table, the older woman smiled at her with a warmth that softened Lena's nerves, and her gentle Italian request for more tea felt like a small anchor in the rising sea of tension. Lena responded kindly, savoring the way the woman's face brightened, because human connection had always been her quiet refuge in places where class and wealth built invisible walls between people. As she poured the tea with slow precision, the billionaire leaned slightly closer, his eyes flicking between her hands and her expression. Studying her like someone examining a puzzle they suddenly suspected had far more pieces than they originally thought. "You speak like someone who lived there longer than a tourist," he said with a measured tone that carried both curiosity and caution, making Lena swallow tightly before answering. She explained that Florence had once been a second home where she learned not only the language but also the rhythm of a life built around caring for someone she loved, though she avoided specifics because the memory still held too much pain. The billionaire listened with an intensity that unnerved her, as if each word she spoke unlocked a door in his mind, and when their eyes met she sensed a thread of recognition she couldn't quite place. His mother reached for Lena's hand again, her frail fingers warm and full of gratitude, and murmured something in Italian about how kindness echoed longer than people realized, sending a sharp pang through Lena's chest. The billionaire watched the interaction with a softened expression, touched by a tenderness he rarely displayed in public. Yet beneath that gentleness, Lena sensed an undercurrent of urgency she couldn't decipher. When she stepped away from their table, she heard the manager calling her name from across the room with a tone that suggested a conversation was imminent, one that likely wouldn't be pleasant. As she followed him toward the corner office with a tightening breath, she glanced back at the billionaire's table and saw him still watching her, calm but calculating, almost as if he understood she was walking towards something difficult. His mother gave her a small, encouraging nod, the kind that felt strangely protective, and for a fleeting moment, Lena wondered why two strangers could make her feel seen in ways that both comforted and terrified her. What she didn't know was that this moment, this fragile intersection of suspicion, curiosity, and kindness, was only the beginning of a shift that would pull long-buried truths back into the light, whether she was ready for them or not. The manager led Lena into the small office near the service station, where muted lighting and the faint smell of printer toner created an atmosphere that felt more like an interrogation room than a workspace, causing her heartbeat to thrum with the steady anxiety of someone who has endured too many conversations that begin with forced professionalism and end with bruised dignity. He gestured for her to stand near the corner while he shut the door, pretending his tone was calm. Yet every clipped syllable revealed a growing frustration he struggled to hide behind corporate courtesy. He began asking pointed questions about her interaction with the VIP table, phrasing each one as if he were politely clarifying expectations, though the tension in his jaw suggested he had already drafted his assumptions before she ever entered the room. Lena kept her responses measured and respectful, explaining that she had simply helped a customer who needed assistance, but her attempt at offering clarity only seemed to give him ammunition for further concern, especially when he asked why she had spoken in Italian without notifying management. She tried not to react too sharply, reminding herself that reacting emotionally only strengthened the power imbalance, yet the idea of needing permission to show kindness struck her as profoundly unfair. As the manager continued speaking, Lena began to sense that his intention reached beyond procedural caution, because every question subtly implied she had overstepped boundaries or tried to attract the billionaire's attention for personal gain. The accusation was never directly stated, yet it hovered like a cold draft brushing the back of her neck, making her feel smaller with each passing second. She fought against the rising urgency in her chest, aware that losing composure would only confirm whatever narrative he had already begun constructing. So she steadied her breathing and met his gaze with a firm calmness that surprised even herself. Just as he prepared to deliver what she suspected would be a thinly veiled reprimand, the door opened slightly and a young busser peeked inside, whispering that the billionaire's mother was asking specifically for Lena because she needed help communicating something important. The manager's expression tightened with irritation at the interruption, but the mention of the VIP's mother caught him off guard enough that he hesitated, allowing Lena to slip out of the office before he could reassert control. She felt a tremor of relief wash over her as she walked briskly back toward the dining room, grateful for the unexpected lifeline she hadn't dared hope for. When she approached the table, the older woman reached out both hands in a gesture of urgent warmth, her eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and pleading that stirred something deep within Lena's chest. The woman began speaking in Italian again, her words flowing faster now, carrying an emotional weight that suggested she had been holding onto them for far too long, waiting for anyone who could understand. Lena lowered herself to the woman's level, gently holding her hands in return, and offered a soft reassurance that she was listening, ready to help however she could. The older woman explained that her hearing had been slowly fading for years, leaving her dependent on lip reading and fragmented speech, which made communication in English exhausting and often isolating. She admitted that she rarely felt understood anymore, not because people were unkind, but because the world moved too quickly for someone struggling to follow conversations carried by sounds she could barely grasp. Lena felt her heart tighten as she listened, recognizing the loneliness in the woman's voice with an almost painful clarity, because she remembered too well what it felt like to exist quietly on the edges of other people's lives. When the woman mentioned Florence, her voice fluttered with nostalgia, describing afternoons spent drinking espresso near the Arno River and evenings filled with music drifting from open windows, painting memories that Lena could almost smell and taste. She responded with gentle warmth, replying in Italian that she had once walked the same streets, held the same breezes, and felt the same quiet magic the woman described. Their shared recollection formed a bridge between them, binding their stories in a way that transcended age, class, and the boundaries of the dining room. As their conversation deepened, the billionaire approached the table with cautious steps, his expression shifting from curiosity to something softer, almost reverent, as he watched the two women exchange sentences that carried far more tenderness than any gesture he had expected to witness. His mother looked up at him with a radiant joy he hadn't seen in years, gesturing at Lena as if introducing someone precious, someone who had touched a part of her heart long thought unreachable. He paused beside them, momentarily speechless, clearly trying to reconcile this emotional transformation with the poised young woman who had served them earlier. Lena released the older woman's hand just long enough to pour fresh tea with the same delicate precision she used for every table, but this time the act carried the weight of something profoundly intimate, as if she were tending to a relative rather than a customer. When she returned the cup to the woman's hands, the billionaire finally spoke, his voice gentler than before, asking what his mother had said that made her so emotional. Lena hesitated, unsure whether sharing the woman's private feelings was appropriate, but the elderly woman squeezed her hand firmly, urging her to translate. With a steady breath, Lena explained that his mother felt seen and cherished in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, adding quietly that the woman believed kindness held the power to heal places where language could no longer reach. The billionaire absorbed her words with a visible mix of respect and introspection, and for a moment the three of them existed in a silence that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a shared understanding settling gently between them. As Lena stood to return to her work, the older woman tugged her hand once more and whispered a final sentence in Italian that made Lena's breath catch in her throat, because the message, simple yet deeply personal, echoed a truth she had tried to bury for years. She whispered that people who carry heavy stories often recognize each other instinctively, even before a single word is spoken, and that meeting her today felt like destiny rather than coincidence. The billionaire watched Lena with a quiet intensity as she stepped away, unaware that her act of simple kindness had just exposed more of her past than she had ever intended to reveal. Lena returned to the service station with a measured calmness that felt more like a survival instinct than genuine composure, because she could sense the billionaire's gaze lingering on her with a quiet intensity that refused to loosen its grip, no matter how desperately she tried to focus on her duties. She reached for clean linens and polished silverware, letting the repetitive motion soothe her racing thoughts, yet her hands trembled slightly each time she remembered the older woman's last whispered sentence in Italian, which had struck her heart with the weight of an unspoken truth she wasn't ready to face. As she arranged a new set of glasses on a nearby counter, she noticed the billionaire rise from his seat with deliberate ease, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored jacket as he stepped away from the table with an expression that blended curiosity, caution, and something faintly protective. The staff instinctively parted as he walked, not because he demanded attention, but because his presence carried a subtle authority that shaped the room around him like a shift in the tide. When he approached her station, Lena straightened automatically, unsure whether she should address him first or wait for whatever question he clearly intended to ask. He stopped a comfortable distance away, though the soft creases around his eyes suggested he was fighting the urge to step closer, and for a fleeting moment the two of them existed in a pocket of silence where the surrounding clatter faded into an indistinct hum. He studied her with the scrutiny of someone who rarely encountered mysteries he couldn't immediately solve, and Lena felt a strange mixture of vulnerability and defiance rising within her because his gaze searched her face with an openness that was both disarming and unsettling. She finally asked if he needed anything, her voice steady, despite the tension curling through her chest. Instead of answering directly, he tilted his head slightly and asked why she had pretended earlier that her Italian was nothing special, especially when she spoke with a fluency and warmth that clearly came from lived experience rather than casual study. His tone carried neither accusation nor arrogance, but rather a gentle insistence that hinted at a desire to understand her rather than judge her, which made Lena's breath catch, because she wasn't accustomed to wealthy strangers offering genuine curiosity instead of polite dismissal. She attempted to deflect by saying she simply wanted his mother to feel comfortable. But he dismissed her answer with a quiet shake of his head, insisting that he had met countless people who claimed to help, yet very few who managed to touch his mother the way Lena had done within minutes. The sincerity in his voice forced her to look away, for she wasn't prepared to confront the possibility that her presence had affected him more deeply than the situation warranted, and she feared what that might mean for the fragile balance she worked so hard to maintain. As she turned her attention to folding napkins, he stepped a little closer, lowering his voice as if trying to create a private space in the middle of the bustling dining room, and asked whether she had ever lived in Italy long enough to call it home. The question landed with unnerving precision, reminding her how easily he had begun picking at threads she had spent years weaving into careful silence. She told him that Florence had indeed been a meaningful part of her past, but she avoided giving details, hoping he might sense the boundary she was quietly drawing. He didn't push immediately, but his eyes lingered with the thoughtful patience of someone accustomed to being answered eventually, and Lena felt a flush rise across her cheeks as she realized he wasn't merely asking for information, he was asking for a window into a life she had closed long before stepping into this restaurant. His posture softened slightly, and with a half-smile that felt disarmingly human, he remarked that she carried a certain familiarity in her expression, as if he had seen her before in a place he couldn't quite recall. The comment struck her unexpectedly, stirring a memory she had buried under layers of time and grief, because she remembered a brief encounter years ago involving a frightened boy, a near accident, and a desperate attempt to calm him using the only Italian phrases she knew at the time. She dismissed the coincidence quickly, refusing to let the past claw its way into the present, yet something in the billionaire's eyes hinted that he sensed a truth hovering just out of reach. Before she could redirect the conversation, his mother called out softly from across the room, her voice carrying a gentle urgency that made him glance back with instinctive concern. Seeing that she wanted Lena again, he turned toward the older woman before looking back at her with an expression that hovered between gratitude and apology, as if he regretted ending their conversation too soon. He quietly asked whether Lena could stay for another moment with his mother, once she finished assisting other guests, adding that the woman seemed calmer whenever Lena stood near her, which made an unexpected warmth curl inside Lena's chest despite her attempts to keep emotional distance. She nodded politely, assuring him she would return shortly, and the relief that flickered across his face surprised her with its sincerity. As he walked back toward the table, Lena felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation settle over her, because every step he took seemed to pull her into a story she never intended to join, yet somehow couldn't escape. She watched him reach his mother's side with tenderness that belied his imposing presence, and the older woman's smile widened the moment she saw Lena approaching with a fresh pot of tea. The billionaire glanced back at Lena once more, his gaze soft yet searching, almost as if he were silently asking whether she would allow him to uncover the pieces of her past she had fought so hard to hide. Lena returned to their table with steady steps, though her pulse thudded unevenly beneath her calm exterior, and as she settled beside the older woman, she realized that the thin line between professional duty and human connection had begun to blur in ways she couldn't easily reverse. She sensed that whatever came next would shift the dynamic between them, deepening the curiosity he felt and tightening the invisible threads binding their stories together, leaving her suspended between fear and an unexpected hope she didn't dare name. What she didn't know was that this moment, the quiet exchange of glances and the subtle warmth that passed between them, was the beginning of a fragile connection that neither power, status, nor caution could fully suppress. Lena carried the tea tray back to the service station with careful steps, trying to steady her thoughts even as a subtle unease crept over her, because the billionaire's growing curiosity felt less like admiration and more like a quiet force tugging at the threads of a past she had spent years trying to conceal. She inhaled slowly, reminding herself that she was just a server in a polished restaurant, not someone important enough to attract real attention. Yet the lingering warmth of the older woman's smile made that excuse feel increasingly flimsy. As she polished a set of spoons near the back counter, she overheard two bartenders discussing a piece of gossip that instantly twisted her stomach because they mentioned the billionaire's family with the kind of hushed awe usually reserved for scandal and whispered tragedy. One bartender leaned closer to the other, explaining that the billionaire's mother had suffered a traumatic incident several years earlier involving a close family friend, which caused her to withdraw from public life and trust very few people outside her immediate circle. The information landed with unsettling weight inside Lena's chest, particularly because the older woman had opened up to her so quickly, almost as if she had sensed something familiar and comforting in Lena's presence. The rumor spread across the staff like a ripple moving through still water, carrying hints of old pain, unresolved betrayal, and long-standing secrecy that clung to the billionaire's family name like a shadow that refused to fade. Lena realized that her simple act of kindness might have stirred emotions the billionaire had worked tirelessly to shield from the unforgiving eyes of the world, and the realization forced her to consider how easily a single moment could unravel years of carefully maintained distance. She wondered whether her presence reminded him of someone he had lost or someone he had once trusted, because the look in his eyes held a mixture of yearning, suspicion, and vulnerability that she couldn't ignore, no matter how desperately she tried. When she returned to the dining area, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere surrounding the VIP table, as though the emotional equilibrium had been disrupted by an invisible current neither she nor the billionaire could fully control. The older woman sat quietly now, her hands resting delicately on her lap, but her gaze kept drifting toward the window as if caught between memory and reality, while her son's expression carried a protective tension that sharpened the edges of his calm demeanor. Lena approached cautiously, uncertain whether she was stepping into a fragile moment or unknowingly crossing a boundary she couldn't undo. The billionaire looked up when he sensed her presence, and his expression softened slightly, though an undercurrent of conflict flickered just beneath the surface, suggesting that he was struggling with something far heavier than simple curiosity. He thanked her for returning and asked if she could stay for a moment, not as an employee but as someone who had managed to reach his mother in a way no one else had done in years. The sincerity in his voice startled her, and she felt an unexpected ache rise in her throat, because his plea carried a quiet desperation that made it impossible to refuse, even though she knew agreeing would only deepen the connection forming between them. As Lena settled beside the older woman, she noticed the faint tremble in the woman's hands, the kind that came from emotional strain rather than physical weakness, and she instinctively placed her hand gently on the woman's arm, offering comfort without words. The older woman whispered softly in Italian, speaking about a person she once trusted who had disappeared without warning, leaving her heart bruised in ways she never quite healed from, and Lena felt the familiar sting of recognition pulse through her, because the story echoed wounds she carried within herself. She responded softly, telling the woman that some absences carve deep spaces inside people, yet they also leave room for unexpected kindness to grow where one least expects it. The billionaire listened quietly, his gaze flicking between them with a mixture of relief and unease, as if their exchange revealed something he had been afraid to accept yet couldn't ignore. He suddenly shifted his posture and asked Lena whether she had ever met his mother before today, his voice carrying a gravity that hinted he wasn't simply asking out of curiosity, but perhaps out of fear that their bond might be rooted in something beyond coincidence. Lena shook her head gently, explaining that she had never seen either of them before, though she admitted that the older woman reminded her of someone she once cared for deeply, a truth she hadn't intended to share but found herself unable to suppress. Her admission caught the billionaire off guard, and a flicker of recognition sparked in his eyes. though he quickly masked it behind a composed expression, as if he had stumbled upon a piece of a puzzle that terrified him as much as it intrigued him. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a tone meant only for her, and confessed that someone from his family's past had disappeared years ago under circumstances that left wounds neither time nor distance could fully erase. His mother had never spoken about the person again, yet every now and then she mentioned sensing echoes of that lost presence in strangers who carried the same quiet gentleness and unspoken sorrow. Lena felt her breath catch as pieces of her own history began to align with fragments of theirs, forming a pattern she wasn't ready to acknowledge but couldn't fully deny. The connection felt too improbable to be real, yet too familiar to be ignored, and a cold shiver ran through her as she wondered whether fate had brought her here or whether she was stepping unknowingly into a past that wasn't hers to revisit. The older woman reached for her hand again, her touch trembling with emotion, and whispered that kindness often returns to those who give it freely, even when the world tries to bury their light beneath the weight of its own fears. The billionaire watched them with a softened intensity, the protective edge in his posture blending with a newfound determination, as if he had suddenly resolved to uncover the truth behind the strange familiarity she evoked in both him and his mother. Lena realized then that whatever fragile balance had existed before was shifting irrevocably, pulling her deeper into a story she had never intended to enter yet somehow couldn't escape, because the threads connecting them were tightening into a tension she felt in every slow, uncertain breath. And as she rose to attend another table, she sensed that this was no longer a simple encounter between a waitress and a wealthy family, but the beginning of a revelation that would test the boundaries of trust, identity, and the past she had tried so hard to leave behind. Lena returned to the polished counter near the service station with a steady pace that felt more practiced than genuine, because despite her calm exterior she could sense a subtle shift in the room, like the moment before a storm when the air grows heavy with unspoken tension. She wiped down the counter with careful circular motions, trying to anchor herself in the familiar routine, yet every small sound, the clink of cutlery, the quiet hum of conversation, the faint rustle of linen seemed sharper than usual, as though her senses were tuning themselves to warnings she couldn't fully interpret. She had barely placed the clean cloth aside when Julian, the senior server, drifted toward her with a smirk that carried the unmistakable sharpness of someone who enjoys delivering bad news disguised as casual commentary. He leaned against the counter with an exaggerated sigh and remarked that the staff had started noticing things, especially how the billionaire kept watching her like she held answers he desperately needed. His tone suggested amusement, but the glint in his eyes hinted at something mean-spirited, as if he believed her brief connection with the powerful family could only be explained through ambition rather than compassion. Lena attempted to brush off his insinuation with a measured response, insisting that she was simply doing her job and nothing more, yet her words felt hollow even to her own ears, because she knew that whatever had happened at the VIP table was far from ordinary. Julian continued speaking with a casual shrug, claiming that some workers had already begun speculating about her motives, especially after seeing how quickly the billionaire trusted her near his vulnerable mother. He suggested that people might assume she had intentionally tried to impress him, planting seeds of false kindness in hopes of attracting attention from someone far above her position. The accusation stung more deeply than she expected, partly because it echoed fears she had kept buried beneath years of quiet living, and partly because it reduced her sincere compassion to nothing more than opportunistic maneuvering. She felt her throat tighten as she tried to steady herself, reminding her inner voice that she had acted out of instinct and empathy, not ambition. Yet the bitterness of Julian's words began to cling to her thoughts like unwelcome shadows stalking the edges of her mind. She excused herself from the conversation with a polite nod, not wanting to give him the satisfaction of seeing how deeply his gossip had unsettled her. As she walked toward the kitchen, she overheard another pair of servers whispering near the espresso machine, their hushed voices laced with speculation and skepticism as they wondered aloud why a waitress would speak fluent Italian unless she had an ulterior motive. One of them suggested that perhaps she had studied the language specifically to attract wealthier clientele, while the other implied that she might have known the billionaire's family before and was pretending otherwise to hide an inappropriate connection. The words pierced her composure like small, deliberate cuts, reminding her how quickly people could twist a moment of humanity into a narrative shaped by jealousy and suspicion. She felt the weight of those whispers pressing against her ribs as she entered the kitchen, where the heat from the ovens and the sharp scent of herbs wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. The bustling energy of cooks darting from station to station gave her a momentary distraction, but the echo of the server's speculation continued murmuring in the back of her mind, reminding her that perception often mattered more than truth in places built upon flawless presentations. She collected a set of dishes and returned to the dining room with a steady, determined pace, forcing herself to breathe through the rising discomfort that threatened to crumble her composure. As she approached the VIP table again, she noticed the billionaire watching her with a quiet intensity that felt sharper than before, as if he had sensed the growing tension surrounding them and was trying to assess whether she was at the center of it or simply caught in its wake. His mother looked up at her with a smile that remained tender despite the subtle fatigue settling around her eyes, and the woman's warm expression gave Lena just enough strength to keep her voice steady as she asked whether they needed anything else. The older woman reached for her hand again, offering a reassuring squeeze that momentarily cut through the fog of doubt fogging her thoughts. The billionaire shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze flicking toward a pair of staff members who darted away the moment he looked at them, as if they feared being caught gossiping about matters beyond their understanding. He lowered his voice when he addressed Lena, asking gently whether she was all right, because he had noticed the tension in her posture and the way she avoided glancing toward the service station. His concern felt unexpectedly genuine, creating a warmth in her chest she fought to suppress, because she knew that allowing herself to trust him could only complicate a situation already tangled with misunderstanding and fragile emotion. Before she could answer, the manager approached the table with a strained smile, greeting the billionaire with overly polite enthusiasm that masked a growing anxiety beneath the surface. He glanced at Lena with a professional formality that bordered on coldness, as if he were trying to re-establish boundaries he believed she had crossed merely by being noticed. His comments were subtle but pointed, suggesting that customer comfort was their top priority and that any miscommunications should be addressed promptly to ensure a seamless dining experience, which only deepened the confusion swirling between Lena and the powerful family seated before her. The billionaire's expression hardened slightly as he interpreted the manager's veiled message, and he redirected the conversation by firmly stating that Lena's presence had greatly improved his mother's evening, making it clear that her actions had been both appropriate and appreciated. His defense caught Lena off guard, and for a brief moment she met his gaze, feeling a spark of gratitude that collided with a confusing flicker of something more fragile and dangerous. The manager stiffened, nodded hastily, and retreated with a hurried excuse, leaving behind a silence heavy with unspoken friction. As Lena stepped away from the table, she could feel dozens of glances trailing behind her, fueled by curiosity, jealousy, and the twisted power of half-heard conversations. She held her spine straight, reminding herself that kindness never needed defending, yet the weight of distorted truth still clung to her steps like a shadow that refused to loosen its grip. She wondered how long she could maintain her composure before the unseen pressure finally cracked the fragile balance she had fought so hard to protect. What she didn't realize was that every rumor spoken in hushed tones was slowly binding her fate to the billionaire's far more tightly than any sincere conversation ever could, pulling her deeper into a storm neither of them fully understood yet, and one neither of them would escape unchanged. Lena stepped into the quieter hallway behind the kitchen, hoping to find a moment of stillness away from the murmured gossip and sharp glances that had begun to cling to her like a second skin, yet the silence she found there only amplified the uneasy pulse echoing through her chest. She leaned lightly against the wall, pressing her hands together in a futile attempt to steady the tremor running through her fingers, knowing the emotional weight pressing on her ribs came not solely from the present, but from the memories she had fought so fiercely to bury beneath years of deliberate stillness. The faint hum of the refrigerator blended with the distant murmur of the restaurant, creating a backdrop that sent her mind drifting back to the years she had spent in Florence, where the warmth of golden sunsets washed over cobblestone streets that felt far more like home than any place she had known before. She had been 19 then, living in a small apartment above a bakery that filled the morning air with the scent of fresh brioche, sharing the space with someone who had been both her greatest comfort and her deepest ache. His laughter had once filled the rooms with light, healing parts of her heart without needing deliberate words or grand gestures, because he understood her in a way she thought only fictional characters ever could. Yet the memory of his smile now felt like a fragile photograph left out in the rain, softened at the edges by grief she had never managed to articulate, because his illness had crept into their lives with a quiet cruelty that neither of them had been prepared to confront. She remembered the nights spent in hospital corridors, clutching a worn notebook filled with scribbled Italian phrases given by a kind nurse who believed learning the language would help her communicate better with the doctors overseeing his care. She had studied every page with desperation, translating medical terms through tears that stained the paper with the weight of impending loss, determined to understand every detail that might offer him comfort or clarity. As his condition worsened, she immersed herself in the rhythms of Florence, absorbing the language not as a casual interest, but as a necessary lifeline that allowed her to advocate for him in rooms filled with unfamiliar voices and sterile white walls. She remembered sitting beside his bed, whispering Italian lullabies she barely understood, hoping the sound of her voice would anchor him to a world slipping steadily from his reach, because the doctors had assured her that hearing familiar tones often helped patients endure the pain. When he finally passed on a quiet winter night, she had felt her own heart crack with a finality so devastating that she fled the city with nothing but a small suitcase and the unbearable fear that any future happiness would feel like a betrayal. The memory of waving goodbye to the Arno River from the bus window still pressed painfully against her ribs, reminding her how suddenly life could steal everything she held dear, leaving her with only echoes of places she once called home. Returning to the United States had felt like stepping into a version of herself she no longer recognized, because the world she had loved so fiercely had been replaced with an absence so profound that she learned to hide it behind polite smiles and quiet obedience. She found work wherever she could, drifting between small diners and temporary jobs until she finally landed at this upscale restaurant, where anonymity became both her shield and her prison. As Lena inhaled deeply, a door behind her opened softly, and the sound of footsteps drew her back into the present, causing her to straighten abruptly with the instinctive poise of someone accustomed to masking vulnerability. The billionaire stepped into the hallway, his expression carrying a blend of concern and an unspoken question, as if he could sense the fragile boundary between her past and present cracking under the weight of resurfacing grief. He approached with cautious steps, pausing just far enough away to respect her space, yet close enough to show his intentions were anchored in genuine care rather than intrusive curiosity. He remarked that he had noticed her sudden disappearance from the dining floor and wanted to make sure she wasn't overwhelmed, because his mother had grown unusually quiet after she left, clearly sensing something unspoken between them. His voice carried a warmth that reached her more deeply than she wished to admit, and for a moment she felt the precarious comfort of being seen by someone who didn't yet understand the tangled scars she carried within her. She attempted to reply with a simple reassurance that she was fine, but the words snagged on the lingering ache inside her chest, forcing her to swallow hard before speaking again. The billionaire studied her expression with the sharp intuition of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately, and he asked whether her familiarity with Italy came from a past she wasn't ready to discuss. The question was gentle rather than demanding, yet it struck a chord that vibrated through her entire being, because the last thing she wanted was for him to uncover the grief she had spent years burying beneath layers of silence. She hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect her pain and the fragile yearning to share even a small piece of it with someone who seemed willing to hold it without judgment. Finally, she revealed that she had lived in Florence for reasons tied to someone she once loved deeply, and that the city had shaped her in ways she hadn't fully understood until she was forced to leave it behind. She didn't provide names or details, but the cracked timbre of her voice carried enough truth to convey the depth of her loss, making the billionaire's expression soften with a sympathy she hadn't expected from a man often shielded by stoicism. He stepped closer, not intrusively, but with a quiet reverence that suggested he recognized the significance of her confession, and told her that grief often leaves invisible scars that only reveal themselves at the most unexpected moments. His mother's voice echoed faintly from the dining room, calling his name with a gentle urgency that pulled him back toward the present. Yet before he turned away, he placed a hand over his heart in a gesture that felt strangely intimate, promising her with a single glance that whatever weight she carried no longer belonged solely to her. Lena watched him leave with an unfamiliar tightness in her throat, realizing that exposure, no matter how partial, had shifted the fragile balance she maintained between survival and vulnerability. As she re-entered the brightly lit dining room, she found herself torn between fear and a fragile hope, wondering whether her resurfaced memories would become the bridge connecting her to a new beginning, or the tether dragging her back into a past she had spent years trying to outrun. The answer lingered somewhere between the billionaire's searching eyes and his mother's gentle smile, waiting patiently for the moment when destiny would reveal its hand. When Lena stepped back into the dining room, the ambient glow of late afternoon sunlight washed across the tables in soft amber streaks, creating a gentle warmth that contrasted sharply against the cold knot of uncertainty, twisting inside her chest, as though the world was offering her comfort she wasn't quite ready to accept. His mother looked up at him with a radiant joy he hadn't seen in years, gesturing at Lena as if introducing someone precious, someone who had touched a part of her heart long thought unreachable. He paused beside them, momentarily speechless, clearly trying to reconcile this emotional transformation with the poised young woman who had served them earlier. The older woman noticed her first, her gentle eyes glowing with affection that felt almost maternal, and she lifted a hand in a slow, beckoning gesture that instantly loosened something inside Lena's ribs, reminding her of how rare it was to be wanted rather than merely needed. Lena approached with steady steps, offering a soft smile as she asked whether the woman would like more tea, but before she could lift the pot, the older woman delicately placed her thin fingers around Lena's wrist, with a familiarity that felt both grounding and fragile. She whispered in Italian, her voice trembling slightly, as though she were offering a confession meant only for someone capable of holding it with tender understanding. The woman said there was a light in Lena's eyes she recognized, a kind of quiet bravery shaped by loss, yet softened by compassion, and she insisted that people who carry pain with dignity often sense each other before a single word is spoken. Her words struck Lena with unexpected force, because they echoed the precise truth she had spent years hiding behind careful smiles and unassuming gestures, and the recognition brought a sting of tears she fought desperately to hold back. She gently squeezed the woman's hand in return, murmuring that she was humbled by the sentiment, even as her heartbeat fluttered unevenly at the unexpected tenderness woven into the exchange. The billionaire watched them with an expression that blended confusion, awe, and an emotion Lena didn't yet have the courage to name, because he looked at her as though she had stepped out of a place he thought existed only in distant dreams. He leaned forward slightly, placing one hand on the edge of the table as if grounding himself, and asked in a low voice what his mother had said to evoke such a visible shift in her demeanor. The honesty in his gaze left her momentarily breathless, not because he demanded answers, but because he seemed genuinely afraid of disturbing a moment that clearly held deep meaning for both women. She considered lying, or at least softening the truth to keep their connection professional, yet something about the openness in his eyes broke down the cautious walls she relied upon to navigate interactions with people she barely knew. She explained quietly that his mother sensed a shared sorrow in her, the kind that binds strangers in ways words cannot fully explain, and that such recognition felt both comforting and unnerving because it reminded her of a version of herself she hadn't touched in years. The billionaire's posture shifted subtly as she spoke, as though he were quietly absorbing the weight of her admission, and the look he gave her afterward was filled with an understanding she had never expected from someone shielded by power and privilege. His mother reached for Lena again, brushing her fingers against Lena's cheek with a tenderness so unexpected that a soft tremor rippled down her spine, because the gesture reminded her of the gentle touches she used to receive from the person she had lost. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the warmth of the woman's touch settle the storm inside her just enough to breathe normally again. And when she opened them, she found the billionaire watching her, with an intensity she could neither decipher nor escape. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement that spoke of shared vulnerability, the kind that arises when two lives briefly reveal their hidden fractures. He finally broke the silence by saying that his mother, despite her struggles, had always possessed an uncanny ability to see the emotional truth in people, a gift that often unsettled those who weren't ready to confront their own wounds. His voice carried a rare softness, stripped of the calculated composure he seemed to rely on in public, and the sincerity in his tone made Lena's heartbeat thud louder than she wished. She told him she could sense that same ability in him, though expressed more subtly, because the way he observed her hinted at someone who had learned to read people out of necessity rather than curiosity. The billionaire's eyes widened slightly at her remark, as if she had grazed a part of his own story he kept hidden behind controlled expressions and rehearsed confidence. And he responded with a quiet admission that life in the public eye often taught him to detect dishonesty long before it reached his doorstep. Yet, he added, something about her presence disrupted that instinct, making him feel both safe and disoriented in ways he didn't entirely understand. His confession lingered between them like a fragile thread of truth neither knew how to handle, yet neither was willing to release. As the older woman sipped her tea with renewed calm, Lena sensed a rare stillness settling over the table, one that softened the tension built from hours of layered interactions and allowed her to expand her breath without fear of collapsing into something fragile. She realized that despite the swirling rumors, the suspicious glances, and the quiet pressure building around her, this moment felt undeniably pure, anchored in human connection rather than expectation or obligation. It was the first time she had allowed herself to simply exist beside the billionaire and his mother without bracing for conflict or misunderstanding, and the unexpected piece of it pulled at something tender within her heart. When she rose to attend another table, the billionaire touched the back of her hand lightly, his fingers brushing against her skin in a gesture so small yet so charged that her breath caught in her throat. He murmured that she shouldn't let the whispers of jealous co-workers reshape the truth of who she was, because anyone with half a heart could see that her kindness came from a place untouched by ambition or deceit. His voice held a rare conviction that warmed the cold spaces inside her ribcage, and she responded with a soft nod before stepping away, her footsteps steadier than they had been in hours. As she moved across the restaurant, she felt the older woman's gaze following her with gentle affection, and the billionaire's lingering warmth trailed behind her like an invisible thread woven from trust, curiosity, and a connection that neither of them had asked for, but both found themselves quietly craving. And for the first time in a long while, Lena wondered whether the fragile hope blooming in her chest might not be something to fear, but something waiting patiently for her to finally welcome it home. The late afternoon light shifted into a richer shade of gold as the sun dipped lower behind the skyline, casting long, gentle shadows across the restaurant floor, while Lena carried a tray of empty glasses back toward the kitchen, unaware that the fragile piece she had found only moments ago was about to fracture under a sharper, more unsettling gaze. She set the tray beside the sink with practiced calm, but a subtle prickle across her skin told her that someone was watching, and when she turned slightly, she found the billionaire approaching with a quiet purpose that made her heart tighten in her chest. He moved with a controlled elegance, each step measured yet unmistakably determined, as though he had been holding a question inside for far too long and now couldn't bear to contain it any longer. His expression carried none of the softness from earlier, replaced instead by a layered intensity that hinted at suspicion, fear, and an almost desperate need for clarity, creating a tension that settled heavily in the space between them. Lena braced herself as he stopped a few feet away. His eyes locked onto hers with an unwavering precision that made her feel both exposed and strangely anchored. Before she could speak, he asked whether she had ever met his mother before that day, his voice low, controlled, and sharpened by an undercurrent of protective caution that made the air feel suddenly heavier. The question was the same one he had touched on earlier, yet the tone carried a deeper urgency now, as if something in his mother's reactions had triggered doubts he could no longer ignore. Lena felt her pulse spike sharply, not because she feared the truth, but because she sensed that any answer she gave would carve a deeper path between their lives, binding them closer or pushing them dangerously apart. She answered softly that she had never met his mother before, choosing every word with careful honesty, yet he didn't immediately seem comforted by her response, because his gaze held a searching intensity that suggested he was looking for something beyond simple truthfulness. He stepped closer, not threateningly, but with the kind of deliberate precision that indicated he had made a choice to confront something he had tried to avoid acknowledging. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tension so subtle, yet so unmistakable that it sent a shiver through her spine. He told her his mother rarely connected with strangers, especially after the traumatic betrayal they had experienced years earlier, and that seeing his mother respond to her with such deep familiarity unsettled him in ways he wasn't prepared to handle. His jaw tightened as he admitted that the last time his mother reacted to someone with that kind of tenderness, it had ended in heartbreak so severe that it changed the fabric of their family forever. Lena felt the weight of his confession sink into her bones, stirring a sorrow she didn't fully understand, yet somehow felt responsible for, as though her presence had resurrected wounds she hadn't meant to touch. She attempted to reassure him, telling him gently that sometimes the heart recognizes echoes rather than faces, and that his mother's warmth toward her seemed more like an instinctive response to shared grief rather than a sign of hidden history. Her words hung in the air for a long moment, during which the billionaire's expression shifted minutely, revealing cracks in his carefully maintained composure, as though he was torn between believing her and fearing the vulnerability her presence evoked. He moved a fraction closer, close enough that she could see the faint tension bracketing his eyes, the kind that came from years of carrying burdens too heavy to share. Then, with a quiet exhale that sounded almost like surrender, he asked a second question, one far more piercing than the first, delivered with a steadiness that concealed the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. He wanted to know why she helped his mother with such tenderness, and whether her actions came from simple compassion or from a deeper connection she refused to acknowledge. The question caught her breath mid-inhale, not because it accused her of wrongdoing, but because it forced her to confront emotions she had tried tirelessly to avoid ever since the moment she first knelt beside his mother. She confessed that she had acted out of instinct, driven by the echo of memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit, memories of comforting someone she once loved through pain and fading hope. Her voice wavered slightly as she admitted that she responded to his mother not because of who she was, but because of what she represented, a familiar tenderness wrapped in a fragile vulnerability she could never ignore. The billionaire's shoulders softened at her words, yet his eyes remained locked on hers, studying her intently, as though her sincerity alone could untangle the knots twisting inside him. His mother's faint voice drifted across the dining room again, calling his name with gentle insistence, but instead of turning immediately, he remained still for a moment, his gaze never leaving Lena's, as though he were silently asking one final question he couldn't bring himself to voice aloud. Only when she lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of his attention, did he step back with a slow, measured breath, giving her the space she desperately needed to steady the tremor in her chest. He walked back toward his mother with long, purposeful strides, though he paused halfway to glance over his shoulder, his expression softened by a mixture of conflict and reluctant trust that made Lena's heart twist with emotions she didn't want to examine too closely. She remained frozen by the counter, her hands gripping its edge, as if anchoring herself against the tide of tension he had left in his wake. because the weight of his questions had drawn her far deeper into his world than she had ever intended to go. When she finally returned to the floor, the older woman reached for her with the same gentle affection as before, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond her warmth. Lena knelt beside her, offering a quiet reassurance that everything was fine. Even though her pulse still trembled from the confrontation she barely understood. She felt the billionaire's gaze settle on her once more from across the table, steadier this time, yet still laced with that unmistakable longing for truth. And as she rose from her position beside his mother, a sudden realization washed over her with quiet finality. The question he had asked wasn't just about the past, it was about trust, vulnerability, and the fragile bridge forming between them, one that neither of them could afford to cross recklessly. Yet for the first time she sensed that he wasn't asking to judge her, but to understand whether the connection pulling them together was something real or merely the illusion of a moment neither of them knew how to escape. Lena stepped away from the billionaire's table with careful, measured breaths, trying to regain her composure even as the weight of his questioning lingered like a shadow pressed against her ribs, reminding her how close she had come to unraveling beneath the intensity of his gaze. She carried herself toward the service station with an air of controlled calm, but beneath the surface her pulse thudded with an unsteady rhythm, as if her body knew what her mind refused to admit, that something was shifting, tightening, and building toward a moment she could no longer avoid. When she reached for a fresh set of linens, she sensed the familiar prickle of hostile whispers circling again from nearby staff members, their eyes glinting with sharp fascination as they watched her navigate the space with renewed scrutiny. Julian muttered to another server that she was clearly trying to manipulate the situation, suggesting that her emotional exchange with the billionaire had been staged to earn sympathy or attention from someone far above her standing. The words sliced through her fragile calm like thin, well-aimed blades, each remark embedding itself into her already bruised composure. She tried to ignore them, focusing on folding napkins into neat, precise triangles, but one server stepped closer and remarked loudly that this was exactly how scandals began. Quiet servers seeking opportunity and wealthy men blinded by sentiment. The air thickened around her with judgment so unfair and so painfully familiar that her hands stilled mid-fold, her breath catching in a knot that felt dangerously close to breaking her resolve. She inhaled slowly, desperate to maintain her dignity. Yet every whisper amplified the lie that she was something she would never allow herself to become. Before she could retreat into the kitchen for a moment of privacy, the manager appeared beside her with an expression pulled tight by suspicion and brittle authority, clearly summoned by the muttered rumors that had begun spreading with the speed of wildfire. He asked her to follow him, and Lena felt the cold grip of dread coil around her spine as she walked behind him toward the narrow private corridor beside the wine racks, where reprimands were delivered discreetly and consequences often struck without room for explanation. The manager folded his arms and informed her that multiple staff members had expressed concerns about her behavior, implying that her interactions with the VIP table had crossed professional boundaries and created an uncomfortable atmosphere that reflected poorly on the establishment. His tone carried the cold certainty of someone who had already decided her guilt long before she entered the hallway, and each accusation pressed against her like a weight designed to crush rather than correct. Lena felt her throat tighten, not with fear but with an ache of exhaustion, because she had spent years trying to rebuild a life defined by honesty and compassion, only to be dragged down again by assumptions shaped by jealousy and misunderstanding. She attempted to speak, to clarify, to defend the sincerity of her actions, but the manager cut her off sharply, insisting that her behavior had placed the restaurant at risk and that she should consider stepping back from serving the VIP table immediately. The injustice of the accusation, so cold, so misplaced, so deeply unfair, sent a tremor through her chest, not of fear but of something quieter, stronger, and far more resolute. Before she could respond, a familiar voice echoed across the corridor with measured force, slicing through the tension like a clean blade through silk, and the billionaire stepped forward with a calm intensity that made both the manager and Lena freeze in place. His posture held no aggressive threat, yet his presence alone shifted the atmosphere, commanding a silence that pressed heavily around them as he approached with steady, deliberate steps. He glanced briefly at Lena, reading the distress hidden behind her composed facade, before turning to the manager with a restrained authority that carried far more power than anger ever could. He asked the manager what exactly Lena was being accused of, his voice low yet unwavering, as though he were testing how far the man would dare push a narrative grounded in false assumptions. The manager stumbled through an explanation about maintaining professionalism, hinting that Lena's conduct might give rise to misunderstandings, but the billionaire's expression grew colder with each word, his eyes narrowing with a precision that could dismantle any argument placed in front of him. When the manager finished speaking, the billionaire responded with a quiet firmness that halted the air itself. He stated that Lena had done nothing inappropriate, and that her actions had provided his mother with more comfort than any staff member had managed in years, making it clear that her presence was not only welcomed but deeply valued. He added that any attempt to reprimand her for offering compassion would reflect far more poorly on the establishment than on her, because kindness should never be punished simply because others failed to understand it. His voice carried no raised volume, no sharp edge, yet the calm strength embedded in his words struck with the force of a silent storm, leaving the manager speechless. The billionaire then shifted his gaze to Lena, and in that moment the entire restaurant seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet connection between them as he asked her a question so soft and sincere that it wrapped around the bitterness of the moment like a balm. He asked why she had returned to his mother after the earlier confrontation, why she had chosen compassion over self-preservation, even when others judged her unfairly. His gaze held no accusation, only a searching need to understand the heart behind her actions. And Lena, her breath trembling with the weight of everything she had endured in silence, met his eyes with a calm steadiness she hadn't realized she was still capable of holding. She answered him with a voice gentle yet resolute, offering the simplest truth she had carried through years of heartbreak and healing. No one should feel alone in a room full of people. The corridor fell silent in the wake of her words, the truth of them settling over their small gathering like a soft, undeniable light that exposed the pettiness of the accusations and the depth of her integrity. The manager lowered his gaze, chastened by the quiet conviction radiating from both Lena and the billionaire, and murmured that he would address the misunderstanding with the staff, though his voice carried none of its earlier confidence. The billionaire looked at Lena once more, with a tenderness laced with something deeper, something unspoken, and something neither of them could yet name, before he gently asked whether she would return with him to his mother's table. Lena nodded, her chest tightening with a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow, and together they walked back toward the warm glow of the dining room, leaving behind the corridor that had nearly swallowed her dignity. What she didn't know was that her quiet, unshaken response had just altered the way the billionaire saw her forever, turning curiosity into reverence, and reverence into something that would soon grow too powerful for either of them to ignore. The restaurant had settled into the soft hush of early evening by the time Lena finished her remaining tables, and although her steps remained steady, her heart had not yet recovered from the confrontation that had nearly unraveled her dignity in front of half the staff. She took a moment near the window to inhale the cool air drifting through the slight draft in the frame, letting it calm the tremor still lingering beneath her ribs, aware that the billionaire's quiet defense had protected her from humiliation she hadn't deserved. Even so, she felt the heaviness of the day pressing against her shoulders, reminding her how close she had come to losing control in a place where composure was her only shield. When she finally returned to the VIP table to check on the older woman one last time, she found an unexpected emptiness waiting for her, because the chairs were neatly pushed in and the plates had been cleared, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender perfume and the lingering warmth of a presence that had comforted her more than she realized. For a moment she wondered whether they had left without saying goodbye, and a quiet ache pulsed through her chest, not from abandonment, but from the sudden loss of a connection that had unraveled her defenses with such surprising ease. She reached out to straighten the silverware, if only to give her hands something to do while she collected herself. Then she saw it. A small cream-colored envelope lay neatly in the center of the table, its edges perfectly aligned with the crease in the tablecloth as though placed with deliberate care. Her name, just her first name, was written on the front in elegant handwriting, each letter shaped with a grace that instantly told her it hadn't come from the manager or any fellow staff member. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers brushing lightly over the textured paper as a soft shiver ran through her, because the gesture felt far too intimate to be accidental. She opened the envelope slowly, half afraid of what it might contain, and slid out a folded piece of stationery along with something far more unexpected, a plane ticket tucked neatly behind the letter, marked for a one-way flight to Florence, departing a week from that day. Her breath caught sharply in her throat, and for several long seconds she couldn't tell whether the room had grown suddenly warmer or whether her emotions had risen too quickly to contain. It would always hold a place for them. The memory rose softly, like a tide she had held back for years, and for the first time she didn't push it away, letting the bittersweet ache wash through her with a strange, unexpected acceptance that felt like the beginning of something she had long denied herself. She exhaled slowly, realizing that healing did not erase the past, but rather softened its edges enough to let her step forward without collapsing beneath its weight. Behind her, the billionaire approached with slow, considerate footsteps, stopping just close enough for her to sense his presence without feeling crowded, as though he knew this moment belonged more to her than to him. He said her name gently, his voice carrying a quiet respect that wrapped around her like a soft shawl. And she turned to face him with a steady calm that surprised even her, because somewhere between the chaos of the day and the tenderness of the letter, her fear had loosened its grip. He asked whether she was all right, not out of obligation but out of genuine care, his expression softened by a vulnerability he no longer tried to hide behind caution or distance. Lena told him she wasn't sure what she felt yet, only that the gesture had touched a part of her she thought had disappeared the night she left Italy, and that the possibility of returning stirred more questions than answers. He nodded slowly, assuring her that the ticket was not a request or an expectation but simply an offering, a doorway back to a place that had held pieces of her heart long before their lives had crossed. His mother's voice, now faint and distant, echoed gently in his tone as he added that sometimes the path to healing requires returning to the places where the heart first learned to break. A quiet stillness settled between them, cradled by the soft glow of the hanging lights and the fading warmth of the evening, creating a moment suspended between past and future, where time seemed to breathe with them rather than move ahead. Lena realized that although the day had shaken her, it had also given her something she never expected, permission to choose a life shaped not by grief or fear, but by her own courage. She felt the tension in her chest loosen, replaced by a steady warmth that whispered of redemption, not as a dramatic transformation, but as a gentle return to herself. She thanked him with a voice steadier than she felt, telling him that whatever choice she made, she would remember his kindness and the compassion that had guided his mother's hand when she wrote those words. His eyes softened with something that looked almost like relief, and he told her that meeting her had reminded him that connection could still be found in the quietest places, even for people who lived behind high walls built from fear and responsibility. They stood for a long moment, sharing a silence that felt more intimate than any confession, bound not by answers but by the fragile understanding that their lives had touched in a way neither could fully explain. When Lena finally walked out into the night, the envelope pressed gently against her chest, she felt a rare lightness settle over her, as though the city air carried a promise she had waited years to hear. She didn't know where the path would lead or whether Florence would offer the closure or renewal she needed, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of hope rising with every step. And, as she glanced back through the restaurant's window one last time, seeing the billionaire watching her with an expression full of quiet faith, she realized redemption didn't always arrive with grand gestures. It often arrived in small, tender moments that invited the heart to breathe again.